The forge room hummed with energy as plasma kilns roared to life, and alloy molds clicked into place with mechanical precision. Sparks danced in the air like fireflies on stimulants. Around the perimeter, students of every species bustled with excitement, assembling high-frequency filaments, calibrating magnetic alignment rigs, and feeding rare minerals into atom splitters. Jack sat on an overturned bucket, holding a rock. Not a glowing, energy-infused meteorite or a molecular-grade cutting stone, just a rock gray, river-smoothed, and utterly unremarkable. In his other hand, he turned a sun-bleached chunk of femur, freshly carved down one side. No one saw him take it earlier that morning from the biome's edge. No one had asked where he was going. No one ever did. To his left, a glowing obsidian blade was taking shape in a stasis field. Across the room, a Zarnathi student nervously adjusted the polarity coils on her crystalline edge. The tension in the room was thick with competition and unspoken pride. "Are you sharpening bone?" Someone scoffed behind him, the translator capturing the disgust perfectly. Jack didn't look up. "Yup. Why not use the Academy's tools?" another voice asked, part curious, part horrified. "Or anything not pulled from a corpse?" Jack gave the bone a final stroke against the stone, tested the edge with his thumb, then looked up. Because, when you're out of options, you work with what already stopped breathing. They stared. He went back to sharpening. The Galactic Academy of Applied Survival Sciences, nestled beneath the protective domes of Kepler 9c's orbital moon, was supposed to be an academic utopia, a multi-species melting pot, a sanctuary of cooperation. But most of the time, it felt like a very clean, very expensive zoo. Species from across 20 systems came to train here. Suvanti, Krielix, Zarnathi, Orten, even a handful of sanctioned Bethelites, and all of them looked at Jack like he was an anomaly they weren't ready to understand. He was the only human, and he was always quiet. The class had been given the assignment 2 days earlier: forge a functional blade using only what could be found in the Academy's simulated wilderness or on-site fabrication tools. A test of survival, engineering, and resourcefulness, Professor Hiran had called it. "This is not about combat," the elderly, Orten instructor had clarified, his triple eyes narrowing under their armored lids. "It is about adaptation." Hiran had meant for the test to be technical. The rest of the class treated it that way. They lined up at the campus's mineral synthesizers, traded rare earth samples like currency, debated over blade curvature algorithms, edge density flow models, and micro-tempered crystal lattices. Jack left the room without a word and didn't return until sunset. When he did, his hands were dirty, his boots were wet, and he carried a knotted piece of cloth containing what looked like a fragment of sun-bleached animal spine. No one said anything directly to him at first, but the whispers spread faster than heat through plasma coils. Why is the human always covered in dirt? Did he kill something for that bone? Is it even legal? The blade itself was simple, almost ugly. About 8 inches from base to point, the curve rough but deliberate. He'd used riverstone to grind the edge into a sloping wedge. It wasn't symmetrical. It wasn't pretty. But when he tied the plant fiber cord around the base for a grip and pulled it tight, the tension sang in a way no filament blade ever did. The instructor gave it a glance, no comment. The class didn't know what to do with that. By the time presentation started the next morning, the tension had curdled into something sour. Students filed into the open presentation hall, each placing their blade on the polished black table at the front of the room. They'd taken care to make them look impressive. Aaron, a Suvanti, had embedded his blade with a shimmer core that glowed green when moved through air. Yelka, a Zarnathi, had forged hers from compressed photon warp crystal, its surface constantly shifting like light on water. Jack placed his bone blade gently, almost reverently, in front of him. He didn't introduce it. He didn't explain. He didn't smile. The silence that followed wasn't comfortable. Professor Hiran, in his droning tone, examined each submission, measured weight, assessed edge integrity, asked thoughtful questions about origin and design. But when he came to Jack's, he hesitated. "This is actual bone?" Jack nodded. "Probably cervid. The leg joint was intact when I found it near the north perimeter of the biome." "You used biological remnants to create a survival tool?" "Yeah." Hiran touched the blade with two clawed fingers and frowned. Cultural eccentricity, he muttered. Noted. He moved on. Behind Jack, someone whispered, barbaric. Another said, disgusting. A third coughed, loudly, primitive. Jack didn't flinch, but his hand drifted to the flat of the blade, fingers checking the edge. Habit. He heard someone say, why would anyone use a dead animal when you've got forges? He didn't answer aloud, but his father's voice echoed in the back of his skull, clear as ever. Because sometimes you don't get forges, you get time and teeth coming at you fast. During the break before the next round of evaluations, Jack sat alone beneath one of the simulation dome's observation trees. He ran a thumb down the blade's spine, counting the tiny grooves he'd filed to help with grip tension. Nearby, Instructor Hiran was muttering into a comm link, something about biosphere breach inspections. He sounded annoyed. A Zarnathi student named Pelka approached cautiously, holding her crystal blade in both hands like a delicate bird. That thing actually cut anything? She asked, not cruelly. Jack looked up at her, then shrugged. Probably better than yours in rain. She blinked. Rain? Crystal blades crack under high-speed temperature change, and they don't cut through wet cartilage well. Too much surface tension. Pelka looked down at her blade, a flicker of doubt creasing her face. You test that? Jack didn't smile, but he said, my brother used to hunt wild hogs with obsidian, real thin edge. Snapped one mid-thrust once, nearly bled out. Pelka stared. You hunt? I used to carry water. He hunted. But, yeah, we all learned. She didn't know what to say to that. She left quietly. The shriek came just as Hiran opened his mouth to call the group back to order. It wasn't mechanical. It wasn't an alarm. It was alive. Something slammed against the outer plex of the simulation dome, followed by a heavy crash and a sound like branches exploding. A red light blinked twice over the main entry gate. Jack was already on his feet. Students screamed. A few froze. Others scrambled toward the exits. From the eastern tree line of the simulated forest, something moved fast and low. The shape was dark, roughly feline but bulkier, its spine lined with armor-plated nodules and twin forward eyes that shimmered in the artificial daylight. Professor Hiran roared, "Containment field breach, evacuate, emergency level 3. A Krellin stalker. Jack had read about them. Apex predators engineered for survival simulation. Not supposed to be lethal, supposed to have control implants, supposed to be confined to simulation sector 9. Supposed to. The creature surged through the practice zone with terrifying momentum. A Zarnathi student tripped and barely rolled out of the way before it carved a deep gouge into the synthetic turf with one of its claws. Most of the weapons, every elegant, high-tech, perfectly engineered blade, were still in presentation cases, or in cooling racks, or just too fragile to assemble on short notice. But Jack already had his in hand. He didn't posture, didn't shout, didn't breathe loudly. He crouched, blade low, eyes locked on the stalker's path. It was weaving, calculating, sizing the group up, but Jack was closest. The predator saw the movement, adjusted its charge, and zeroed in. It lunged. Jack stepped sideways, not back, and his arm moved like a reflex, not a decision. The bone blade slid upward in a tight arc, catching the creature just beneath the lower jaw, angled forward. The curve of the bone carried the cut through the underside of the skull, deep into soft tissue. The stalker crumpled mid-motion. Its rear legs skidded forward. The rest of it slammed to the ground with a dull, final thump. Silence. The kind of silence that has weight. The kind that stops instructors mid-command and freezes 30 students in place. Jack stepped back, the blade still in hand. The edge was stained dark, and one corner had cracked. Not broken, just cracked. He exhaled, slow, then wiped the blade clean on his sleeve and tied it back at his belt. "It's not elegant," he said to no one in particular, "but it cuts." After the stalker hit the ground, time didn't restart so much as stagger forward like a stunned animal. The medbots came first, buzzing low and clinical as they scanned the twitching carcass. One hovered over the Krellin's head, emitting a low-frequency pulse to confirm neurological death. Another wheeled past Jack, hesitated, then pivoted to scan him too. No injuries, Jack said quietly, but the bot ran a diagnostic sweep anyway. It beeped twice, logged vitals, and floated off without a word. Behind him, the class still hadn't moved much. One student, Tarux, from the JAL system, was sitting with his legs folded awkwardly beneath him, blinking slowly like he'd just missed an entire lesson. His presentation blade, a lattice of micro-serrated flux steel, lay discarded in the dirt 10 feet away. It hadn't even made it out of its case. Instructor Hiran moved next. He didn't storm over or shout. He just walked, heavy-footed, eyes locked on the body of the predator and the slim bone blade now resheathed at Jack's hip. For a long second, he just stood there, arms crossed, triple eyes narrowing. "Report," he said finally. Jack nodded. It came through the east perimeter, took out part of the tree cover. No signs of sedation or inhibitor devices. Probably a containment override or power bleed. Not my field. Hiran's jaw flexed. "I meant your response." "I was closest." It charged. Blade went through submandibular access point, just behind the ridge. Jack didn't blink. "I got lucky. Hit the artery, then spine." A low cough broke the tension. Pelka again, standing near the side of the clearing with her crystal blade now hanging limp at her side. "That's not luck." Hiran raised one hand to quiet her, but his expression had shifted. Not angry, not even confused, something closer to reevaluation. "You recognize the anatomy," the instructor said. "Mid-charge." "I grew up butchering game." Jack scratched behind his ear. "You learn where the joints and weak spots are, fast, especially when it's something bigger than you." "You hunted?" a nearby Suvanti cadet asked, the word sharp with disbelief. "Real animals?" Jack looked over. "Still do. My uncle runs meat dogs back in Montana. Wolves and cougars mostly. Sometimes elk, if the permits line up." Hiran's expression didn't change, but he exhaled heavily through his nose. "Montana is a Terran biome designation?" Jack nodded. "West North America. Temperate terrain, seasonal weather, mid-range predators, decent training ground." No one spoke for a while after that. Eventually, Hiran turned away, signaling the remaining staff to begin biohazard containment and log the breach. His last words before he walked off were flat, but quieter than usual. "Blade evaluations are suspended until further notice. Dismissed." The walk back to the dorm compound was slow. Nobody walked near Jack. It wasn't ostracism exactly, more like the kind of distance one gives a loaded firearm. Even the students who'd laughed about the bone blade yesterday kept their voices low and their eyes pointed forward. Jack didn't mind. He didn't feel like talking either. He cleaned the blade before he went in river water from the biome edge, a palmful of fine grit sand, and steady circles with a cloth until the edge was clean again. The crack near the tip was more pronounced now. Bone didn't like torsion. He'd have to reinforce it if he wanted to use it again. Maybe a heat-baked resin wrap, maybe just retire it. Inside his dorm, the walls flickered to life with environmental data and holofeeds about the breach. He ignored them, unstrapped his belt, took off his boots. His hands were still trembling, though not visibly. But he could feel it deep in the ligaments, the shake that came after the danger passed. He hated that part. He ran his fingers down his forearm. No cuts, no bruises, no swelling. He'd taken no hits. The blade had gone clean, but the tension in his left trapezius told him he'd overextended on the follow-through. He stretched until it clicked, then sat down on his bed and stared at the ceiling for a long time. By the following morning, the mood across campus had shifted. The academy had sealed Sector 9 entirely. Security drones hovered at every major junction. 2 more instructors, one from defensive strategy, another from ecosystem engineering, joined Hiran in his office. Students whispered in hallways. Some stared at Jack as he passed. Others looked away quickly, as if eye contact might invite some unspoken challenge. Even the food printer in the dining commons felt slower to respond. Jack sat alone, eating something approximating scrambled eggs and toast, when someone finally approached. Not a fellow cadet. Instructor Hiran. "May I sit?" the old Orden asked. Jack blinked. "Sure." Hiran folded into the seat across from him with surprising grace for a creature with exoskeletal knees. He placed a small data pad on the table, but didn't activate it. "I misjudged your submission yesterday," Hiran said plainly. Jack stabbed at his toast. Yeah, I figured. I took your bone blade as an affectation, a kind of cultural eccentricity. Hiran tapped the table once, his claw clicking faintly. Now I understand it was the only functional weapon in that room. Jack shrugged. Others might have worked, just not fast enough. No, Hiran said, his voice low. Not just fast, real. Yours was the only weapon meant to be used. That hung in the air for a moment. Hiran leaned forward slightly. I've been an instructor here for 17 cycles. I've seen cadets build blades that can slice through ferro steel, but can't be held in a wet hand. Blades that glow, sing, or fold into microfields, but would shatter on bone. Yours had flaws, but it worked. Jack didn't respond at first. Then, we don't always have time for elegance back home. Tell me about your training. Jack hesitated. I wasn't trained, not formally. My dad and uncles make knives, real ones. Steel, obsidian, bone, glass, you name it. We always had scraps around the shop, so I started early, made my first blade at 6. Wasn't sharp, but it cut my thumb deep enough to remember. Hiran's eyes didn't blink. So you made this bone blade, casually? No, Jack said quickly. Not casually. Seriously. That's the point. If someone handed you a raw cut of meat and said, you have 20 minutes or starve, you don't reach for a ceremonial carving set. You reach for something that works, even if it's ugly. The instructor nodded slowly, almost thoughtfully. I would like to include your design in the Academy's tactical archive. Jack raised an eyebrow. Even with the crack? Especially with the crack. Hiran allowed a rare flicker of humor. Reminds cadets that survival isn't about perfection. It's about precision under pressure. Jack leaned back. I don't need recognition. I know, Hiran said. But the others do. By afternoon, things had settled, slightly. Classes resumed, though now with mandatory safety briefs before every session. Some students approached Jack with questions cautiously, like testing a wild animal's patience. How did you know it had come at you first? Why didn't you run like the rest of us? Did you actually touch the body afterward? Jack answered what he felt like answering. Let silence handle the rest. It wasn't until later that evening, during a required debrief with the Academy's Trauma Assessment Unit, that someone finally asked the question that had been building under the surface all day. You don't seem particularly shaken, the attending medic, a soft-spoken Bethelite, observed. Adrenaline crash, yes, but no signs of acute stress, no panic response. Elevated baseline cortisol, but nothing irregular. That's unusual. Jack took a moment to respond, then looked her dead in the eye. I've seen worse. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The medic stared at him a little longer than necessary, then quietly updated her notes and signed him off for class re-entry. Back in his room, Jack laid the cracked bone blade on his desk and stared at it in the low light. He turned it over once, twice, ran his finger along the uneven edge. A knock came at the door. He opened it to find Pelka standing there, holding a small bundle wrapped in cloth. I don't want to build with crystal anymore, she said, eyes darting briefly toward the blade behind him. Think you could show me how to sharpen without tech? Jack considered for a moment. Sure, he said, but first, we're finding better bones. The next morning, Pelka showed up outside the biome gate wearing a field harness 2 sizes too big and a look halfway between apprehension and stubborn resolve. Jack gave her a once-over. You ever track before? I've studied topographic mapping, she said, straightening the oversized harness, and emergency terrain analysis protocols. That's not tracking. She hesitated. No. Jack nodded and handed her a walking stick. Not carbon alloy, just real wood, stripped smooth and wrapped at one end with braided vine for grip. Pelka took it like it might bite her. Keep your eyes open, Jack said. Stay to the higher ground, and if you see anything with more than 4 legs and teeth, don't run, just yell. What if yelling doesn't work? Jack grinned faintly. Then, run faster than me. They hiked for 2 hours. Not deep into the biome, just far enough past the simulated pine line to reach the gully where Jack had found the first bone. The place was a disused runoff zone near the simulation's edge, where leftover animal carcasses sometimes ended up after the larger predator simulations ran their course. The Academy didn't advertise it, but Jack had learned fast. Even a simulated ecosystem had its graveyards. Pelka gagged when they found the ribcage. It was mostly picked clean. Climate bots kept the biome tidy, but the bones were intact, sun-bleached and dry. The spine still arched like a question mark against the slope. Jack knelt beside it, brushing debris off one of the longer leg bones. "You see this ridge?" he asked, pointing with a flat rock. "That's a stress point. Won't hold under lateral force. We'll take the femurs. They're denser." Pelka crouched next to him, nose wrinkling under her rebreather mask. "How can you tell that just by looking?" "Can't. Not completely. But after you've broken a few, you start noticing patterns." They packed out 4 long bones, wrapped in cloth and tied off with old plant fiber Jack had prepped earlier. He didn't say it aloud, but these bones were cleaner than the one he'd used before, stronger, less brittle. If he tempered them right and reinforced the haft with resin, they could hold a proper edge. Pelka still looked queasy. "You all right?" She nodded quickly. "I'll get used to it." Jack offered a hand and helped her up. "It helps when you stop thinking about it as dead. Start thinking about it as useful." "Useful corpse parts," she muttered. Jack shrugged. "Nature doesn't waste. Neither should we." Word got around. It wasn't just Pelka. Within 3 days, 5 more students came asking questions. At first, it was just curiosity. What did you bind the grip with? How do you sharpen bone without chipping it? Isn't plant fiber unreliable? Jack answered what he could, demonstrated what he couldn't explain. Soon, someone asked him to show them how to actually carve a blank. Then, another. Then, a Zolari cadet Rega, tall and copper-skinned, with arms like scaffolding, brought in a stone blade of his own, and asked, awkwardly, if Jack could check the balance. Jack took it, gave it a few slow passes through the air, then rotated his wrist. Too front-heavy. Good for chopping, but useless if you need quick direction change. You want it here. He tapped the midpoint of the blade with 2 fingers. Center of gravity needs to sit close to your grip. Rega just stared at him. You really were raised with this, weren't you? Jack gave a slow nod. It's not magic. It's just doing something long enough that your hands stop needing your brain to help. They were sitting under the maintenance canopy near the simulation dome when Instructor Hiran found them. He didn't interrupt at first, just stood off to the side and watched Jack demonstrate how to file a bevel into bone with a sandstone slab and some water. After a few minutes, he stepped forward. This is not curriculum, Hiran said, not angry, more curious than anything. No, sir, Jack replied, standing. You're teaching blade work. Jack hesitated. Not officially. Then officially, you're supplementing field survival instruction with cultural skill demonstrations. The old Orton tilted his head, triple eyes blinking in sequence. Unorthodox. But not forbidden. Rega grinned. Pelka tried to hide her smile. Jack just nodded. Got it. Hiran turned to go, but paused. Don't let them forget the theory behind the craft. They won't, Jack said. But they'll learn the weight of it too. That night, Jack stayed late in the forge room. Not using the forges, just working on the new blade with the cleaner femur bone, tempering the shape over time with riverstone and heat-blasted resin. He added a shallow groove to the spine this time, for blood channeling. It wasn't pretty, but it moved better through wet tissue. He was sanding the final edge when the door hissed open behind him. It wasn't a student. Deputy Administrator Volsk entered tall, leathery-skinned, wearing an immaculate diplomatic sash and holding a tablet the size of a small table. Jack Parker, Volsk said, voice calm but cold. Jack didn't stand. Yes, sir. You've triggered 3 separate security reviews this week, one involving restricted biome access, another concerning unsanctioned instruction, and the last, Volsk's long fingers tapped the tablet. A weapon lethality report filed by medical staff after the Krellin incident. Jack nodded. That all checks out. Volsk stepped forward. The Academy is a controlled environment. It's designed for theoretical survival training, not actual violence. What happened during the breach, while unintended, was escalated by the presence of lethal instruments. Jack set the bone blade down slowly. So, you're saying I shouldn't have acted? I'm saying, Volsk said, tapping the table, that this institution does not cultivate warriors. We cultivate analysts, tacticians, problem solvers. Jack leaned forward. And what would one of your tacticians have done? Asked the stalker to wait while they assembled a photon blade from its case? Volsk's eyes narrowed. You used an unregulated organic weapon to kill a simulation predator on campus grounds, in front of 30 witnesses. I saved 5 cadets from serious injury, possibly worse. That, Volsk said, is debatable. The silence between them thickened. Then Jack said, Bone's not elegant, but it cuts. Volsk stared at him, then quietly turned and walked out without another word. The disciplinary review came the next day. Held in a small glass panel conference room just off the administrative tower, it was meant to be private, but the windows weren't soundproof. Half the campus could see who went in and who came out. Jack sat across from a panel of 3, Hiran included. Volsk presided. The review lasted 30 minutes. They asked about intent, about protocol, about whether the blade had been crafted with the specific purpose of violating campus safety parameters. Jack answered simply, I made it because it was part of the assignment. I used it because I didn't want anyone to die. When it was over, Hiran stood and said only, No disciplinary action recommended. Volsk's jaw flexed, but he didn't argue. Jack walked out into the sunlight where Pelka and Rega were waiting, along with 2 other cadets Jack barely knew. None of them spoke at first. Then Rega asked, Did they tell you to stop? Jack shook his head. Not yet. Pelka held out a small package, leather-wrapped and warm. I brought you lunch. Thought you might forget again. Jack blinked. Thanks. As he unwrapped the food, he noticed something tucked under the napkin, a small strip of folded paper. Inside was a neatly scrawled message. If the rules break before the blade does, maybe the rules need sharpening too. He looked up. Pelka didn't say anything, just smiled. The first real rain came 3 days later. Simulated, of course. The Academy's biome domes were too far from any atmosphere thick enough to weep on their own. But the hydrologics team ran a full-cycle weather event to prep for the next semester's aquatic survival module. Jack didn't mind. The air smelled cleaner after, and the cadets who once laughed at bone blades learned quickly that humidity did cruel things to delicate tools. He walked the perimeter trails that evening, boots squelching in the soft dirt, bone blade tied at his hip like it always had been, the new one, finished, reinforced, sharpened along the double bevel, balanced to the ounce. It wasn't beautiful, not like the shimmering crystal ones in the display case by the front office, but it didn't need to be. It just needed to work. By the end of the week, the Academy had quietly introduced a new elective, Primitive Materials Application, Field Tools and Weaponry. Hiran was listed as lead advisor. Jack's name appeared in the footnotes of the curriculum file, tagged under consultant. Not faculty, not instructor, just there. He didn't care. What mattered was that the elective filled instantly. Overcapacity, actually. A full third of the student body had registered before the first module was published. What mattered was that students had started building not to impress, but to survive. And what mattered most, though Jack would never admit it aloud, was that someone finally added a second rack beside the forge room entrance, labeled non-synthetic materials only. It was half full by the end of the day. On the last day of the cycle, the class assembled for a post-assessment field test. Not theoretical, not decorative, real. 15 students entered the biome with a single task: build a shelter, light a fire, purify water, and carve a tool using only what they carried. No synthesizers, no drones, no AI assist. Just what they could find. And what they had learned. Hiran watched from the hillside, datapad in one clawed hand, raincloak pulled tight. Jack stood beside him, arms crossed. Think they'll manage? Hiran asked, not sarcastic. Jack watched as Pelka knelt by a gnarled tree root, working a stone wedge under the bark to peel clean strips for binding. Rega stood beside her, scoring a groove into a length of wood with a blade made from laminated horn. I think they'll surprise you, Jack said. Hiran grunted. One cycle ago, none of them could start a fire without a laser spark. Now they can do it with 2 wet rocks, Jack said, smiling faintly. Hiran's eyes crinkled. Your methods are still considered unconventional. I'm not trying to replace the curriculum, Jack said. Just remind people the galaxy doesn't always play by Academy rules. They stood in silence as a Solari cadet accidentally set part of her sleeve smoldering and screamed, then extinguished it by plunging her arm into the river and laughing. Do you think all humans are like you? Hiran asked after a while. Jack exhaled through his nose. No, probably not even most. I just come from a place where forgetting how to make something with your hands could mean going hungry. Or worse. Hiran tilted his head. And do you believe that makes your approach superior? Jack shook his head. No, just more available, when everything else fails. The instructor tapped a note into his pad and said, almost to himself, survival as accessibility. They watched for another minute before Jack said, I need to check the south team. They were assigned to marsh terrain. Could be some bog rot out there. Hiran nodded. Go. Jack turned to leave, then paused. Hey, he said over his shoulder. Thanks. For what? For letting me stay. Hiran's expression didn't shift, but something in his posture eased. Bone's not elegant, he said, echoing the old line. But it cuts. Jack grinned. That it does. The marsh team had improvised a rain catch using woven reeds, bark shingles, and gravity-fed condensation runnels. Their water container was a carved-out root bulb sealed with beeswax and sap. It worked. Jack inspected it, offered a few suggestions, then moved to the perimeter to double-check the area for sign of residual predators. The Krellin attack hadn't repeated security, had overhauled the containment systems, but he'd noticed something unsettling lately. The students didn't fear the predators anymore. They feared not being ready. He passed a small clearing where two students were practicing silent movement drills with homemade foot wraps. Beyond that, another group was setting tripwire traps, laughing as one of them accidentally triggered his own and fell face first into wet leaves. These weren't the same cadets who had scoffed at a bone blade weeks ago. They were quieter now, sharper, not grim, not paranoid. Just aware. Jack found Pelka sitting by the fire ring she'd built low, tight, wind-shielded with layered stone. She looked up as he approached and gestured him down. I'm getting better, she said without preamble. He took a seat beside her. You are. She held out a short blade, bone and stone mixed, bound with sinew soaked and dried for tension. Took me 3 tries to get the groove right. I was splitting the tip. He turned it over in his hand. You adjusted the angle. I didn't try to make it symmetrical this time, she said. I just made it work. He nodded. That's the point. Hey, Jack? Yeah? Why'd you come here? The academy, I mean. Jack was quiet for a long moment. My dad used to say there are 2 kinds of people in a crisis, he said eventually. Those who wait for someone to save them, and those who sharpen a stick and start moving. Pelka looked at him. And he wanted you to be the second? No, Jack said. He wanted me to teach the first kind how to use the stick too. They sat quietly for a while. Then Pelka pointed to the distant tree line. You ever think about what you'll do after all this? Probably go home, maybe apprentice with my uncle again, make things. Not apply for off-world service? Jack gave her a look. You think anyone wants the guy who killed a Krellin stalker with a bone blade? She smirked. I think a few people would. He smiled. We'll see. When the final survival evaluations were published, they didn't list scores, just a simple note from instructor Hiran. Survival is not measured by metrics alone. It is measured by readiness, by instinct, by application, by the weight in the hand when all other systems fail. Jack's name wasn't at the top. It was in the margin, not as a student, but as a reference. Some students joked about it. Others just started carrying a second knife on their hip, handmade, ugly, and brutally functional. When the next incoming class arrived, their instructors handed out standard academy toolkits. And a single note printed at the bottom of the welcome pack. Forge your blade, but be ready to use it. Jack left the academy a month later. He didn't say goodbye to everyone, just the ones who asked. Hiran shook his hand without words. Pelka gave him a lopsided blade she'd made from horn and bark fiber, her first solo piece. He accepted it like it was a medal. As the shuttle lifted off, he stared down at the campus, the biospheres, The little trails that had cut their way across terrain, designed to simulate adversity. He reached into his pack and pulled out the bone blade. Cracked, scuffed, retired now, but still sharp. He turned it over in his hands one last time and smiled. It wasn't about the weapon. It never was. It was about the hands that knew how to use it.